I remember the exact moment he laughed, because it wasn't just a chuckle or a polite little shrug it off kind of thing. It was loud, sharp, the kind of laugh that makes other people turn their heads and wonder what the joke is. Except the joke was me standing there in my own driveway telling my neighbor that his brand new fence was sitting on my land. And he just leaned against his porch railing like he had all the answers in the world and said, "Evan, you might want to go read your paperwork again." And I swear there was this smirk, like he'd already won something I didn't even know we were competing over. And for a second, I almost second-guessed myself. Almost. But then I looked past him at that fence, cutting straight across the back corner of my yard, taking a clean bite out of space I'd mowed, seeded, watered, and paid taxes on for nearly 2 decades. And I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger exactly, more like certainty, the kind that doesn't need to shout. His name was Marcus Bell, moved in about 8 months before all this started. Mid-50s, maybe. The kind of guy who always had a project going, always outside with a tape measure, or a contractor, or a truck dropping off materials. And at first I figured, hey, good for him, Neighborhood could use someone fixing things up. But then the little comments started, the kind you can't really call out without sounding petty. Like when he mentioned offhand that my hedges looked a little generous on his side. Or when he joked at a barbecue that property lines in this neighborhood were more like suggestions. And people laughed, including me. Because that's what you do. You keep things smooth, you don't turn every sideways comment into a confrontation. But that fence wasn't a joke. 6 feet tall, cedar panels, fresh concrete footing, still pale against the soil. And it didn't follow the old line where the previous wire fence had been, the one that had been there since before I bought the place. No, this one cut inward, clean and confident, like someone had decided the map needed adjusting and just went ahead and did it. I walked over the first time the panels went up, hands in my pockets, trying to keep things neighborly. And I said, "Hey Marcus, I think that might be over the line a bit." And he didn't even look surprised, just wiped his hands on his jeans and said, "Nope, had it checked." Quick, dismissive, like the conversation was already over. And when I asked who checked it, he just shrugged, said, "Contractor knows what he's doing." And that was the moment I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a decision. Over the next couple of weeks, he turned it into a story, told anyone who'd listen that I was confused, that I didn't understand my own property, that I was making noise over nothing. And you could feel it shift, the way neighbors started looking at me. Not hostile, just uncertain, like maybe I was the guy who didn't quite have his facts straight. And I'll be honest, that part got under my skin more than the fence itself. Because land is one thing, but reputation, that's harder to measure, and a lot harder to fix once it slips. So I went down to my basement, pulled open the old fireproof cabinet I'd had since the day I bought the house, and I started laying everything out. The original deed, the closing documents, the subdivision plat, even the notes I'd scribbled years ago when I first walked the boundaries with a surveyor. And as I spread those papers across the table, it felt like stepping back into a version of myself I hadn't needed in a while. Because before I retired, I spent 22 years as a land development consultant. The kind of job where you don't get the luxury of guessing, where inches matter, where a misplaced line on a map can turn into lawsuits, delays, real money, real consequences. And I knew, looking at those documents, that I wasn't mistaken. The next time I went over, I brought copies, not to wave them in his face, just to show him. Give him a chance to correct things without it becoming something bigger. And I remember standing there while he flipped through the pages, barely glancing at them before handing them back. And he said, "If you've got a problem, Evan, you can take it up with a lawyer." And then he smiled again, that same thin, confident smile, and added, "Or better yet, go get yourself a survey. See what it tells you." And then he laughed. Actually laughed, like the idea itself was ridiculous. I nodded, said, "All right," and walked back home. And I think that's when the situation really changed. Not outside, not yet, but inside my head. Because up until then, I'd been trying to keep it simple, keep it friendly. But the moment someone invites proof, real proof, and laughs about it, well, you either back down or you follow through. And I've never been much for backing down, when I know I'm standing on solid ground. So that night, I made a call to a surveying firm I trusted, a group I'd worked with years back, people who did things by the book, no shortcuts, no guesswork, and I scheduled a full boundary survey, not just for the disputed corner, but the entire lot, every line, every reference point, because if we were going to do this, it was going to be clean, precise, and undeniable. And as I hung up the phone, I remember feeling strangely calm, like the outcome was already written, we just hadn't read it out loud yet. Marcus, of course, had no idea what was coming, and the next morning I saw him out by the fence again, talking to another neighbor, gesturing toward my yard, probably telling the same story he'd been telling for weeks. And for a brief moment, I wondered if I should say something, give him a heads up. But then I thought about that laugh, the way he dismissed everything without even looking, and I decided he'd find out soon enough. The survey crew was scheduled for Tuesday, early, and as that day got closer, I could feel the neighborhood's quiet attention building. Not openly, no one was taking sides out loud, but you could sense it in the way people lingered a little longer in their driveways, the way conversations paused when I walked by, like everyone knew something was about to happen. They just didn't know how it would end. And neither did Marcus. Not really, because confidence is easy when it hasn't been tested yet. And that Tuesday morning was the first time things started to shift in a way no one could ignore. One of those early suburban mornings, where the air still feels untouched, like the day hasn't made up its mind yet. And I was already up before sunrise, coffee sitting untouched on the counter. Not because I was nervous exactly, but because I knew how these things unfold. Slow at first, almost boring if you don't understand what you're looking at. And then all at once, very, very clear. And right around 7:15, I heard the first truck roll in. Low diesel hum, tires crunching lightly against the curb. And when I stepped outside, I saw them. 3 men, clean uniforms, tripods, equipment cases, everything organized in a way that told me immediately these weren't the kind of guys who eyeball anything. The lead surveyor, older guy, maybe late 50s, introduced himself as Daniel Carter. Firm handshake, steady eye contact, the kind of presence that doesn't need to explain itself. And I gave him a quick overview. Nothing dramatic, just facts. Pointed out the fence, handed over copies of my documents, and he nodded like he'd seen versions of this story 100 times before, which he probably had, and said, "We'll run the full boundary, tie it back to the county plat, verify all original markers, if they're still in place." And then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "We'll know exactly where things stand." That word, exactly, stuck with me. They started at the front of the property, setting up their total station, calibrating, checking line of sight down the street. And it wasn't loud work, no dramatic movement, just precise, measured steps, numbers being called out, notes written down. And for a while it felt almost anticlimactic, like watching someone solve a problem you already know the answer to. But then I noticed the first neighbor step out, Mrs. Donnelly from across the street, pretending to water her plants a little longer than usual. And then another, and another, until there was this quiet audience forming, not close enough to interfere, but close enough to see, to feel like they were part of something unfolding. Marcus came out around 8 o'clock, coffee mug in hand, and at first, he didn't even register what was happening, just glanced over, probably assumed it was utility work or something unrelated. But then he saw the equipment, the tripods, the reflective markers, and his eyes landed on me for a second, quick, calculating, and I watched that confidence flicker. Not disappear, just adjust, like he was rewriting the script in his head. He walked over, slow, controlled, and said, "What's all this?" Even though he clearly knew. And I said, "Survey." Just one word, calm, neutral. And he let out this small breath through his nose, almost a laugh, but not quite, and said, "Well, guess we'll settle it then," like he was still in charge of how this story ended. Daniel didn't get involved in any of that. Didn't even look up. Just kept working, calling out measurements to his team, moving point to point. And after about an hour, they reached the side yard, the area where the old boundary had always been understood to run. And that's when things started to tighten, not visibly at first, but in the air, like a pressure shift before a storm. They located the first iron pin near the front corner, partially buried, but still intact. And I saw Daniel crouch down, brush away the dirt, confirm the marking, and log it. And then they moved toward the back, following the line that pin defined. And that's when Marcus stopped moving altogether, just stood there, arms crossed now, mug forgotten somewhere, watching more closely than before. By the second hour, the crew was deep into the rear portion of the lot. And that's where the fence cut through, clean and straight, like it belonged there. Except the measurements they were calling out didn't match that line, not even close. And I could see Daniel double-checking, not because he was unsure, but because that's what professionals do when something carries consequence. They verify, then verify again. At one point, Marcus spoke up, voice tighter now. "You sure you're referencing the right plat?" And Daniel finally looked at him, just briefly, and said, "County subdivision filing, original record." "Yes," and went right back to work. No argument, no defensiveness, just quiet certainty. And that seemed to unsettle Marcus more than anything else. Neighbors were definitely watching now, no pretending otherwise. Small clusters forming, low conversations, the kind that stopped the second someone raises their voice. And I caught a few glances my way, different this time, less doubt, more curiosity, maybe even a hint of anticipation, like they were starting to realize this wasn't just a neighborly disagreement anymore. This was something with a definitive answer. Then came the moment, and it didn't arrive with any kind of dramatic build-up. No music, no announcement. Just Daniel walking from the last measurement point back toward the fence, clipboard in hand, numbers already calculated. And he paused right near where the cedar panels met the back corner, looked at the structure, then at his notes, and then he turned toward me. "Mr. Hayes," he said, voice clear but not loud. "Based on our measurements tied to the original subdivision markers and verified against the county plat." And he took half a step to the side, gesturing toward the fence. "This structure sits 4 feet 3 inches inside your property line." And for a second, everything just held. No one spoke, not me, not Marcus, not the neighbors. Even the ambient noise felt like it dropped out. And I remember noticing the smallest details, the way the wind moved through the top of the fence panels, the faint hum passing somewhere down the street, the weight of those words settling into the space between all of us. I nodded, slow, more to acknowledge the confirmation than anything else, because I already knew, but hearing it out loud, officially, changes something. It makes it real in a way belief alone doesn't. And then I looked at Marcus. He wasn't smiling anymore, not even close. His jaw was set, eyes fixed on the fence, like if he stared at it hard enough, it might shift back into place. And for a moment, I almost felt something like sympathy, because I've seen that look before, the moment when certainty cracks and reality steps in, and it's not a comfortable transition. He cleared his throat, said, "That doesn't make sense." Quieter now, less performance, more confusion. And Daniel, still calm, replied, "We can walk you through the measurements if you'd like." Offering explanation, not confrontation. And that professionalism, that lack of emotion, somehow made the situation even more final. Marcus shook his head slightly, like he wasn't ready to hear it, and just said, "Oh, I'll look into it," and stepped back, creating distance, physically and otherwise. And I didn't push, didn't say anything, because there was nothing left to argue. The numbers had already spoken. The crew finished up shortly after, marking the verified boundary clearly, documenting everything. And before they left, Daniel handed me a preliminary report, said the official documentation would follow, and added, "If this proceeds to a formal dispute, this will hold. Simple, direct, no embellishment." By the time their trucks pulled away, The neighborhood had already shifted again, conversations picking up, people drifting back to their routines, but with that lingering sense that something definitive had just happened. Something that would be talked about later, in driveways, over dinners, maybe even retold with a little extra drama, depending on who was telling it. Marcus went inside without another word, and for the first time in weeks, the yard felt like mine again. Not because anything had physically changed yet. The fence was still there, cutting through space it didn't belong in. But because the uncertainty was gone, replaced by something solid, measurable, undeniable. What I didn't know then was how quickly things would escalate once the county got involved. The county didn't take long, not nearly as long as people like to assume when it comes to paperwork and disputes and all the slow-moving parts of local government. Because once the official survey report was filed, clean, verified, tied directly to the original subdivision records, it triggered something automatic, procedural, like a switch being flipped behind the scenes. And about 10 days later, I got a notice in the mail, stamped, formal, the kind of envelope you don't mistake for anything casual. And inside was a copy of the encroachment determination, along with the order issued to Marcus Bell, stating in plain language that the structure he had installed extended 4 feet and 3 inches into my property and needed to be removed entirely, including all concrete footings, with the land restored to its prior condition. No room for interpretation, no gray area, just facts followed by consequences. I didn't go over there right away, didn't feel the need to stand on his porch and watch him read it, because by then this wasn't about proving anything anymore. It was about letting the process run its course. And for a couple days, the street felt oddly quiet, like everyone knew the next part was coming, but no one wanted to be the one to bring it up first. And then early one morning, maybe 7 o'clock again, I heard that same kind of truck roll in. Different crew this time, heavier equipment. And when I stepped outside, there it was, the beginning of the undoing. Marcus was already out there, talking to the foreman, voice low but tense, hands moving in short, sharp gestures. And even from a distance you could tell, this wasn't a friendly conversation. This was negotiation mixed with frustration, maybe even a little disbelief that it had gotten this far. And I caught a few words drifting across the yard. No way around it. County order. Full removal. And that last one seemed to land the hardest. They started with the panels, prying them loose section by section, the clean lines of that fence coming apart much faster than they'd gone up. And there's something about watching something get dismantled that used to stand so confidently. It changes how you see it, like it loses whatever authority it once had. And as each panel came down, more of my yard opened back up, familiar space reappearing piece by piece. Marcus didn't laugh, not once. He stayed close at first, overseeing, maybe hoping to salvage something. But once they brought in the equipment to break up the concrete footings, he stepped back, further and further, until he was standing near his garage, arms crossed again. But this time it wasn't the same stance as before. There was no confidence in it, just containment, like he was holding himself together while everything else came apart. A couple neighbors drifted by, slow walks, casual waves, but no one lingered too long. And I think that was intentional, because at this point, it wasn't entertainment anymore. It was consequence. And there's a certain respect people give that, even if they don't say it out loud. At one point, as the last section of fence came down, Marcus walked over to the property line, now clearly marked, stakes visible, flags fluttering slightly in the breeze. And he just stood there, looking down at the ground like he was trying to reconcile two different versions of reality. The one he'd been so sure of, and the one sitting right in front of him. I walked out then, not in a hurry, just steady, and stopped a few feet away, giving him space. And for a moment neither of us said anything, because what do you say after something like that? There's no clever line, no satisfying speech, just the weight of what's already happened. Finally he exhaled, long and slow, and said, "Didn't think it'd go this way." And there was no edge in his voice anymore, no sarcasm, just something quieter, almost reflective. I nodded and said, "Yeah, I figured it might." He gave a small, humorless laugh at that, shook his head, and added, "Cost me just over 9 grand, you know." Like he was stating a fact he still couldn't quite believe. And I said I'm sure it did. Not gloating, not softening it either. We stood there another few seconds, and then he said something I didn't expect. "I thought you were bluffing." And I looked at him, really looked this time, and realized that for him, this had never been about the exact line, not really. It was about assumption, about thinking I wouldn't push it, that I'd let it slide to keep the peace, because most people do, most of the time. And I said, I wasn't. He nodded once, like that settled something internally. And then he turned and walked back toward his house, not defeated exactly, but different. Like the version of him that had laughed on his porch a few weeks earlier didn't quite fit anymore. The crew finished restoring the ground over the next couple days, filling, leveling, reseeding. And by the end of the week, it was like the fence had never been there at all, except for the faint color difference in the grass and the memory of how quickly things can shift when lines get crossed, literally and otherwise. Life on the street eased back into its usual rhythm. People waved again, without that undercurrent of curiosity. Conversations returned to normal. And every now and then someone would bring it up in passing, usually framed as a lesson, something about checking your facts or not underestimating your neighbors. And I'd just shrug, because I never really saw it as a victory, not in the way people like to package these things. It was just resolved. But here's the part I still think about sometimes, the part that doesn't tie up as neatly as the rest. Because a few weeks after everything was done, Marcus started putting in a new fence, this time right along the verified boundary, measured twice, maybe 3 times, and he kept it lower, simpler, nothing like the imposing structure from before. And one afternoon he caught me outside and said, "Figured I'd do it right this time," with a half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I said, "Looks good," and I meant it. And that could have been the end of it. Clean, simple, a lesson learned, and everyone moves on. Except there's always that lingering question, the one people don't always agree on, because some folks on the street later told me I should have just let it go in the beginning. That 4 feet wasn't worth the tension. That, being right, isn't always the same as being smart. While others said if I hadn't pushed back, it would have set a precedent. That next time it might not be 4 feet, it might be more. And then where do you draw the line? I still don't have a perfect answer for that. All I know is sometimes the difference between keeping the peace and standing your ground comes down to whether you're willing to be the one who doesn't laugh along when something feels off. Whether you're willing to follow through when someone calls your bluff, even if it makes things uncomfortable for a while. So I'm curious what you think, honestly, because this could have gone a lot of different ways, depending on 1 or 2 choices early on. Should I have just let it slide and kept things friendly? Or was it the right move to push back and see it through, even knowing it would cost time, money, and a pretty uncomfortable stretch of neighborly tension? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read more of them than you'd expect, and I'm interested to hear where you land on it.